That morning, no one expected a single act of defiance to change military history. What began as routine training became a moment every soldier on base would remember, and one that would test the difference between following orders and doing what's right. The cold Hereford rain fell in a steady drizzle, turning the gravel paths of Stirling lines into a slick, unyielding mire. Dawn had barely broken, the sky a uniform grey that pressed down on the SAS selection barracks like a damp blanket. Lance Corporal Ellis Hargrove stood at the edge of the parade square, his boots planted firmly in the mud, watching the new intakes form up for their morning drill. At 34, Hargrove was a fixture here, a signals operator assigned to the support wing, reliable, unremarkable, the sort of man who blended into the background of any briefing room. His uniform was immaculate, trousers creased to razor sharpness despite the weather, but there was something in his posture, a subtle rigidity to his shoulders, that spoke of burdens carried in silence. The sergeant major's voice cut through the downpour, clipped and unyielding. "Fall in, you lot. This isn't a holiday camp. Move!" The recruits shuffled into line, their faces pale and drawn from the night's minimal sleep. Stirling lines, the beating heart of Hereford's SAS training ground, demanded precision from the outset. Roll call followed, names barked out in alphabetical order, each response a sharp "Here, sir," that echoed off the low brick buildings. Hargrove waited his turn, eyes fixed on the horizon where the Welsh hills blurred into the mist. He had been here for years, transferred in after a stint in signals intelligence that no one questioned too closely. Whispers followed him sometimes, about a discharge from active ops, a classified posting gone sideways, but they faded quickly under the weight of daily routine. As the parade square filled, the air carried the scent of wet concrete and boiled tea from the cookhouse. Major Reynolds, the officer in charge of the week's endurance phase, strode out from the officers' mess, his greatcoat buttoned against the chill. He was a tall man, mid-40s, with the weathered face of someone who had seen service in the Gulf and beyond. "Right, lads," he announced, his tone measured, devoid of theatrics. "Today we test your mettle on the fells. Navigation, survival, the lot, no excuses. The regiment doesn't tolerate weakness." Nods rippled through the ranks, a collective intake of breath. Hargrove adjusted his bergen, the straps digging into his shoulders, and fell in with the support detail. His role was straightforward: monitor comms, ensure the frequencies stayed clear. Nothing heroic, just the quiet grind that kept the machine turning. The group moved out in formation, boots striking the gravel in rhythmic unison, the sound muffled by the rain. They passed the memorial wall, where names etched in stone honored those who had fallen in service, quiet sentinels to the unspoken code of the SAS. Hargrove's gaze lingered for a fraction longer than necessary, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features before he looked away. He had known men whose names were there, or close enough. The regiment's losses were never public, but they lingered in the corridors like ghosts. By mid-morning, they had reached the edge of the moorland, the training area stretching out in vast, undulating sweeps of heather and bog. The rain had eased to a fine mist, but the ground was treacherous, sucking at their boots with every step. The exercise was standard, small teams tasked with plotting a route to an extraction point, simulating a patrol under duress. Hargrove's unit was paired with a veteran squad from 22 SAS, men whose faces were etched with the lines of quiet professionalism, eyes sharp, movements economical. Sergeant Wilkes, the squad leader, gave Hargrove a curt nod as they set off. "Keep the radios hot, Lance Corporal. We don't want any cock-ups." Hargrove acknowledged with a brief, "Understood, Sergeant," his voice even, betraying nothing. He had worked with these men before, or ones like them, but always from the periphery. In the mess hall back at base, the banter turned sharp sometimes. "Hargrove's our tea-boy," one private had joked last week, eliciting chuckles over lukewarm stew. "Thinks he's special with his fancy kit." Hargrove had said nothing, just cleared his plate and left, the weight of it settling like the rain on his shoulders. He was good at his job. Signals never failed under his watch. But competence alone didn't earn respect in a place like this. Hierarchy ruled, rigid and unforgiving, and he occupied the lower rungs without complaint. As the team pushed deeper into the moor, the terrain grew unforgiving. The mist thickened, visibility dropping to a few dozen meters. Hargrove monitored the handheld, static crackling faintly as he relayed positions. Grid reference confirmed, ETA to waypoint 15 mics. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency over the dials, but his mind wandered briefly to older ground, nights on similar fells, not in training but in the shadows of operations that demanded silence above all. A classified insertion in the Brecon beacons years back, when he was still with an intelligence detachment. Whispers of a Moorland phantom had circulated then, a figure who materialized from the fog to turn the tide. But that was buried deep, redacted from records, a past he carried alone. The crack came subtly, as these things often did in the regiment. One of the recruits, a young private named Ellis, no relation, Hargrove noted wryly, stumbled on a hidden peat bog, his boot sinking ankle-deep. Laughter erupted from the rear, not cruel but edged with the fatigue of the march. "Steady on, Ellis," Wilkes called back, his tone dry, "or you'll be swimming to exfil." The private flushed, hauling himself free, but the moment lingered, a reminder of the thin line between discipline and disdain. Hargrove paused, offering a hand without a word, pulling the man up with steady strength. No thanks were exchanged. It was simply done. Further on, as the squad crested a rise, the wind picked up, carrying the faint tang of peat smoke from some distant burn. Major Reynolds signaled a halt for a brief inspection, eyes scanning the line for any lapse. Hargrove stood at ease, Bergen balanced, but he caught the major's glance, brief, appraising. There was tension in the air now, not overt but palpable, like the hush before a briefing on a high-risk op. Routine training, yes, but beneath it pulsed the unspoken. Every exercise was a test, every step a potential fracture in the order that bound them. As they pressed on, Hargrove felt the familiar pull of the land, the moors whispering of trials past and present. No one knew yet how this day would unfold, how a single thread of defiance would unravel the fabric of assumption. But in the quiet spaces between commands, the moor held its secrets waiting. The squad resumed their advance across the moor, the ground yielding underfoot with a soft, insistent suck that tested every step. Hargrove adjusted the strap of his Bergen, the weight of the radio pack a familiar anchor against the shifting terrain. The mist clung to their uniforms, beading on the coarse weave of their combat jackets, and the air held the earthy bite of damp heather crushed beneath boots. Sergeant Wilkes led from the front, his pace deliberate, setting a rhythm that brooked no deviation. Behind him the men formed a loose column, rifles slung across chests, eyes scanning the horizon not for threats, but for the subtle cues of the land itself, rises and hollows that could turn a straightforward patrol into a trial of endurance. Sterling Lines had instilled this discipline from the outset, a place where routine was the forge that shaped raw recruits into something resembling soldiers. Back at base, the days unfolded with clockwork precision. Reveille at 0500, the shrill blast of the bugle cutting through the pre-dawn hush of the barracks. Hargrove would rise without complaint, making his cot with corners tucked tight enough to bounce a coin, then proceed to the signals hut for the morning check. There, amid the hum of generators and the faint ozone scent of electronics, he calibrated frequencies, logging each adjustment in the duty book with meticulous care. No flourish, no fanfare, just the quiet assurance that when voices crackled over the airwaves during an op, they would be clear and unbroken. The hierarchy was etched into every interaction, as unyielding as the granite memorials lining the approach to the parade square. Privates deferred to lance corporals with a nod or a clipped, "Sir?" while sergeants like Wilkes commanded with a glance, their authority vested in years of service rather than volume. Majors such as Reynolds oversaw it all from a remove, their presence a steadying force during briefings in the low-ceilinged ops room, where maps unfurled across scarred wooden tables, and the air carried traces of pipe tobacco from officers long gone. Hargrove occupied his place in this order without resentment, though the undercurrents of it wore on him like the persistent drizzle. He was competent, more than that in truth, but in a unit where tales of selection marches and covert insertions passed like currency. His role in signals felt peripheral, a support act to the main drama of the regiment. As the Moorland patrol continued, the team paused at a designated waypoint, a cluster of weathered rocks marking the halfway point to the extraction zone. Wilkes signaled the halt, and the men dropped their Bergens with controlled thuds, forming a loose perimeter while Hargrove set up the portable antenna. His hands moved with the economy of long practice, uncoiling the wire and securing it against the wind that now whipped across the fells in gusts. "Comms check," he said into the handset, his voice level, threading through the static. Responses came back from the forward teams. Solid copy. Affirmative. No praise followed, just the resumption of movement. But Hargrove noted the absence of glitches, the seamless relay that kept the exercise on track. In the mess hall the evening before, the routine had been much the same, though laced with the subtle barbs that defined off-duty hours. The long trestle tables, scarred from years of communal meals, groaned under trays of shepherd's pie and overbrewed tea, the steam rising in curls that fogged the windows overlooking the drill square. Hargrove had queued in silence, tray in hand, when Private Ellis, still smarting from some minor infraction during kit inspection, bumped his elbow, sending a spoonful of peas scattering across the floor. Laughter rippled from the adjacent table, a low chuckle from Corporal Davies, a wiry signals tech with a penchant for needling those he deemed soft. "Steady on, Hargrove," Davies had said, his tone light but pointed. "Can't have you dropping the lot before we've even started." Hargrove had knelt without a word, retrieving the mess with a napkin, his expression unchanging as he rose and continued to his seat. No retort, no flash of anger, just the measured act of clearing away, then eating in quiet isolation at the end of the bench. The others moved on to talk of the upcoming exercise, voices overlapping in the familiar cadence of barracks banter, the bite of the wind on the beacons, the endless tab to the hills. Hargrove listened, contributing only when asked, his responses brief and to the point. "Forecast says rain," he'd offered once, earning a snort from Wilkes. "Always does in these parts. Try not to drown the radio. Tay?" It was meant as jest, but it landed like a reminder of his station, essential yet apart. Now, on the moor, that separation felt amplified by the isolation of the landscape. The team crested another rise, the ground falling away into a shallow valley where rivulets of water snaked through the peat. Major Reynolds called a formation check, his voice carrying over the wind. "Eyes front. Eberskins aligned. We're not tourists out here." The men adjusted, postures straightening under scrutiny, and Hargrove complied seamlessly, his kit squared away as if for parade. Reynolds's gaze passed over him without lingering, but there was a flicker of acknowledgement. The radio pack functioning without hitch, positions relayed accurately. In the regiment, such details were the sinews of success, unspoken but vital. As they descended into the valley, the mist parted briefly, revealing the stark outlines of distant tors against the greying sky. Hargrove's mind drifted to the rhythms that bound them all. The evening stand easy in the Nafi, where tea was poured strong and silent, or the pre-dawn runs along the perimeter paths, boots echoing in unison on the wet tarmac. These were the threads of order, woven tight through discipline and restraint. Yet beneath it Hargrove carried his own quiet competence, a reservoir of skill honed in shadows he no longer discussed. The moor seemed to echo that duality, vast and indifferent, holding its breath as the patrol pushed onward. Wilkes glanced back once, his expression unreadable. "Keep it tight, lads. No stragglers." The order rippled down the line, and Hargrove fell in step, the weight of his pack a steady companion. In this world of rigid lines and measured words, defiance was a distant notion, but the moor had a way of testing even the firmest foundations. The day wore on, routine unbroken, yet the air hummed with the potential for fracture, subtle as the shift in wind direction. The patrol pressed deeper into the valley, the ground softening into a deceptive carpet of heather that masked deeper pools of peat. Hargrove's boots sank slightly with each step, the resistance pulling at his calves, a reminder of the moor's unyielding nature. The wind had steadied to a low moan, carrying the faint acrid scent of bog water disturbed by their passage. Sergeant Wilkes maintained the lead, his silhouette cutting a precise line against the haze, while the rest of the squad followed in disciplined file, Bergens swaying in sync. Major Reynolds brought up the rear, his presence a silent enforcer of the pace. No one spoke beyond the necessities, position calls, terrain warnings, each word economized, as was the way in the regiment. Hargrove monitored the radio intermittently, the handset cool against his palm despite the exertion. Static whispered through the earpiece, a constant undercurrent to the rhythm of their march. He adjusted the frequency with a gloved thumb, ensuring the link to base remained unbroken. In the signals hut back at Sterling Lines, such tasks were routine, logging transmissions in the leather-bound ledger, the pen scratching softly under the glow of a desk lamp. But out here, on the fells, it was the lifeline, the invisible thread that could mean the difference between extraction and abandonment. He had always taken pride in that reliability, though pride in the regiment was a quiet thing, worn like the patina on a well-handled rifle. As the valley narrowed, the team approached a steep incline, the slope rising sharply to a ridge dotted with outcrops of gritstone. Wilkes signaled the ascent, and the men shifted formation, leaning into the climb with measured effort. Hargrove followed, his breathing steady, the Bergen distributing its load across his frame without complaint. Halfway up, Private Ellis, the same young recruit from the earlier stumble, faltered, his footing slipping on loose scree. He caught himself with a grunt, but the momentum sent a cascade of pebbles rattling down the slope, narrowly missing Corporal Davies below. Davies twisted sharply, his face hardening as he steadied his balance. "Watch it, Ellis!" he snapped, his voice carrying an edge sharper than the wind. The corporal was a fixture in the support wing, 2 years Hargrove's junior, but quick to assert his rank in the informal pecking order of the barracks. He scrambled up a few paces, closing the gap, and jabbed a finger towards the private. "You trying to bury us all? This isn't a bloody picnic." Ellis muttered an apology, cheeks flushed beneath the mud streaks, but Davies wasn't done. His gaze flicked sideways to Hargrove, who had paused to assist, extending a steadying arm to the private. "And you, Hargrove, always the good Samaritan. Save your energy for the kit that actually matters." The words landed like a casual aside, but there was intent in them, the kind that festered in the close confines of shared quarters. Davies grabbed Hargrove's sleeve briefly, yanking it to emphasize his point, the fabric twisting under the force. "Keep the radio from slipping like your mate here, eh? We can't all play hero on the moors." Hargrove withdrew his arm without resistance, his expression unchanging, eyes meeting Davies for a level second before dropping to the path ahead. No retort escaped his lips. He simply resumed the climb, pulling Ellis along with a firm grip on the man's elbow. The moment passed, swallowed by the grind of the ascent, but the squad felt it, the subtle fracture in the line, the way Davies' barb hung in the air like peat smoke. Wilkes glanced back once, his jaw tightening imperceptibly, but he said nothing, pressing onward as if the exchange had been wind alone. At the ridgetop, the team regrouped, breaths coming in controlled huffs amid the vast sweep of the moorland. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing the undulating expanse stretching to the horizon, where the faint outline of Credenhill's barracks clung to the earth like a steadfast anchor. Major Reynolds called for a brief stand-down, his voice cutting through the quiet. 5 mics, hydrate, check kit, no slacking. The men complied, sinking to one knee or resting against rocks, canteens unscrewed with the soft clink of metal. Hargrove knelt apart, unpacking the radio for a quick diagnostic, his fingers tracing the dials with familiar precision. The device hummed to life, frequencies clear, but his mind replayed the tug on his sleeve, the casual dismissal that echoed the mess hall jibes. Back at base, such incidents were woven into the fabric of daily life, unremarkable yet cumulative. The cookhouse, with its long counters of steamed trays and the perpetual aroma of boiled cabbage, served as the evening stage for these undercurrents. Hargrove recalled the previous night's meal vividly, the queue shuffling forward under the harsh fluorescence, trays clattering as portions were ladled out. He had balanced his own carefully, mashed potato, a slab of greyish meat, when Davies, queuing behind, accidentally nudged his elbow. The tray tipped, a section of gravy-soaked bread sliding to the floor with a wet splat. Laughter bubbled from the line, low and knowing as heads turned. "Clumsy sod," Davies had quipped, not bothering to lower his voice, while a couple of privates snickered into their sleeves. Hargrove had stooped immediately, retrieving the mess with a napkin from the dispenser, his movements deliberate, unhurried. No one offered help. Instead, Wilkes, seated nearby, had shaken his head with a dry, "Sort yourself out, Lance Corporal," Can't have the signals going soggy. The Major, passing through on his way to the officers' annex, had paused briefly, eyebrow arched, but continued without comment. Hargrove rose, discarded the soiled napkin in the bin, and claimed his seat at the far end of the table, fork scraping plate in isolation. The conversation flowed around him, speculation on the morrow's tab, the relentless mud of the fells, but he contributed only nods, his silence a shield against the barbs. Now on the ridge that shield held firm as Davies wandered over, feigning interest in the radio setup. Still tinkering, Hargrove. Hope it doesn't let us down like last time. There had been no last time, no failure on Hargrove's watch, but the implication stung, a staged reminder of his place. The corporal's hand clamped onto Hargrove's wrist this time, ostensibly to steady himself on the uneven ground, but the grip lingered, squeezing just enough to assert dominance. Wouldn't want to be out here without backup, would we? Hargrove met the pressure evenly, his wrist unyielding, but his face remained impassive, gaze fixed on the horizon. He eased free without a word, repacking the antenna with the same quiet efficiency. Ellis watched from a few paces away, discomfort etching his features, but he said nothing, averting his eyes as Reynolds called them back to formation. The Major's inspection was thorough, eyes raking the line for any disarray, uniforms aligned, weapons secured. Hargrove passed muster without note, his posture rigid, the incident dissolving into the Moor's vast indifference. As the squad descended the far side of the ridge, the ground leveled into a broad flat, where the heather gave way to firmer turf. The air grew heavier, laden with the promise of heavier rain, and the first fat drops began to patter against their hoods. Wilkes set a brisker pace now, the extraction point drawing nearer, but the tension from the ridge trailed them like a shadow. Hargrove adjusted his stride, the radio's weight a constant, his silence unbroken. In the regiment, injustice came not in grand gestures, but in these petty accumulations, the grab of a sleeve, the dropped tray, the mockery masked as banter. He bore it with the restraint drilled into every soldier, posture straight, eyes forward, no crack in the discipline. Yet beneath that reserve, the Moor seemed to stir, its ancient whispers carrying echoes of older trials. The Moorland phantom of legend, a spectral saviour in the fog-shrouded ops of yesteryear, flickered in Hargrove's thoughts unbidden. He pushed it down, focusing on the path ahead. But the fracture widened subtly, the air charged with unspoken challenge. Routine held for now, but the test was upon them, awaiting in the rain-slicked distance. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far stories of courage and integrity can reach. The rain returned in earnest as the squad crested the final rise, a relentless sheet that blurred the line between earth and sky. Hargrove wiped the water from his brow with the back of his glove, the fabric sodden and heavy against his skin. The extraction point lay ahead. A nondescript clearing marked by a cluster of survey flags whipping in the wind, but the Moor had one more trial in store. Sergeant Wilkes raised a fist, halting the column with a sharp gesture, his eyes narrowing against the downpour. "Hold position," he called, voice steady over the patter. "Comms, Hargrove, get a sitrep to base. Something's off with the grid." Hargrove unslung the radio pack, kneeling in the mud to extend the antenna, the metal slick under his fingers. Static crackled as he keyed the mic, relaying their coordinates with precise intonation. "Delta Team, grid 045312, approaching exfil, visibility low, terrain compromised. Over." The response from Sterling lines came back fragmented, laced with interference from the storm. He adjusted the dials methodically, shielding the unit with his body until the line cleared. "Copy that. Stand by for confirmation." Routine, unremarkable, but essential, the kind of task that bound the regiment's operations like invisible sinew. As he worked, a low rumble grew in the distance, not thunder but the muffled throb of rotors slicing through the mist. The squad turned as one, postures tensing instinctively. From the eastern flank, a Chinook emerged like a spectre, its dark silhouette materializing against the grey. It wasn't the standard support bird. This one bore the understated markings of 22 SAS, a visiting element from Credenhill for a joint evaluation. The aircraft hovered briefly, then settled onto a makeshift LZ 100 meters downslope. downwash flattening the heather in swirling eddies. Doors slid open, and figures disembarked, 6 in total, clad in subdued greens, movements fluid and contained, betraying no haste despite the deluge. Major Reynolds straightened, signaling the squad to stand easy but alert. "Eyes on, lads, that's Bravo Wing, keep it professional." The visitors approached at a measured pace, Boots navigating the bog with the ease of men who knew these fells intimately. Leading them was Captain Thorne, a high-ranking SAS officer whose reputation preceded him like the shadow of the hills, veteran of insertions in the Balkans and beyond, his face a map of quiet endurance, eyes set deep under a brow furrowed by classified burdens. Flanking him were troopers from the unit, their burgans light, weapons carried with the nonchalance of second nature. No salutes exchanged yet. In the regiment, recognition came through presence alone. Thorne's gaze swept the line as they closed the distance, appraising without overt scrutiny. It lingered on Hargrove for a beat longer than the others, noting the way he collapsed the antenna with economical precision, stowing it without a wasted motion. Hargrove rose, falling back into formation, water streaming from the brim of his cap, but he met the captain's eyes briefly, level, unblinking, before dropping his gaze to the ground. Thorne said nothing, merely nodded to Reynolds, the two officers conferring in low tones, words lost to the wind. The joint brief was brief, as such things were, a shared objective adjustment due to the weather, merging the patrols for a simulated recovery drill. "We'll take point on the ridge traverse," Thorne stated, his voice even, carrying the clipped vowels of the Welsh borders. "Your signals, man." "Hargrove, is it? We'll sink our fricks, no gaps." Reynolds assented with a curt affirmative, and the groups integrated seamlessly, the SAS elements slotting into the column like pieces of a well-oiled mechanism. Hargrove adjusted his pack, falling in behind Wilkes, the newcomer's presence a subtle shift in the air, tighter, more contained, as if the moor itself held its breath. As they moved out, the combined unit traversed a narrow defile, the walls of peat rising on either side like ancient ramparts. Hargrove monitored the merged comms, his earpiece now alive with dual channels, relaying pings between the squads. The SAS troopers ahead set a relentless but sustainable pace, their footfalls silent on the sodden ground, conversations minimal. One, a sergeant with a faint scar tracing his jawline, glanced back once, his expression neutral, but Hargrove caught the flicker of recognition in the man's stillness, a pause in step, a subtle tilt of the head. It was gone in an instant, swallowed by the rain, but Hargrove felt it settle like dew on his shoulders. Further along, the path widened into a boggy flat, forcing the line to spread. Hargrove's boot caught a hidden sinkhole, the ground giving way with a sudden yield that pulled him ankle deep. He extricated himself without fuss, leveraging his Bergen for balance, but in the motion his sleeve rode up, exposing a faded tattoo on his inner forearm. A stylized Moorland silhouette, etched in black ink, the lines blurred by time and exposure. It was no ordinary mark, a regimental echo, known only to those who had served in the shadows of deep-cover ops, the kind redacted from personnel files. Captain Thorne, bringing up the rear of his element, was close enough to see. He didn't react overtly, no exclamation, no question, but his pace slowed fractionally, eyes tracing the ink before flicking to Hargrove's face. The lance corporal tugged his sleeve down, resuming his stride without acknowledgement, but Thorne's posture shifted imperceptibly, shoulders easing, a nod so slight it might have been the wind. In the regiment, such details were currency, whispers of shared history, operations where signals operators like Hargrove had woven the net that caught lives from the brink. The Moorland Phantom, they had called it in hushed briefings years back, a lone figure who materialized from the fog during a botched insertion in the Scottish Highlands, guiding a pinned team to safety through improvised relays and uncanny knowledge of the terrain. No names attached, just the legend, buried under layers of classification. The column pressed on, the rain easing to a persistent mist that clung to their forms like a second skin. Hargrove contributed to the flow without drawing attention, his voice steady over the net. "Freck stable, vector confirmed." But now, the SAS men's glances carried weight, observant, reserved, shown not in words, but in the way they deferred space around him during a brief halt, allowing him first access to the map overlay without command. Sergeant Wilkes noted it, brow furrowing slightly, but said nothing, attributing it to the visitor's protocol. As the defile opened onto a windswept plateau, the air carried the sharp tang of ozone from the storm's retreat. Thorne drew level with Hargrove briefly, under the guise of checking the radio readout. "Solid work," he murmured, the words barely audible, pitched for Hargrove alone. No elaboration, no probe into the tattoo or the past it evoked, just the acknowledgement, heavy with implication. Hargrove nodded once, eyes forward, the exchange dissolving into the march. Yet in that moment, the observers had arrived, their quiet scrutiny peeling back the layers of routine, hinting at fractures in the facade Hargrove had maintained. The moor stretched onward, indifferent to the undercurrents now stirring beneath the surface. The combined unit moved as one, discipline unbroken, but the air hummed with unspoken observation, the subtle discipline of men who recognized their own in the shadows. Hargrove bore it in silence, his competence no longer invisible, the weight of hidden history pressing like the mist against his skin. The day was far from over, and the moor's secrets were only beginning to unfold. The plateau leveled out under the fading mist, the combined unit fanning into a loose semicircle for the recovery drill's commencement. Captain Thorne directed his troopers with minimal gestures, a raised hand here, a pointed finger there, their positions taken with the precision of men who had executed such maneuvers in far less forgiving terrains. The exercise had evolved under the joint command, simulate a downed asset extraction, with Hargrove's signals linking the mock casualties to the approaching rescue element. The Moorland provided the perfect stage, its undulating expanse dotted with false markers simulating enemy positions, the wind whispering through the heather like distant radio chatter. Hargrove knelt at the center of the setup, uncoiling a field wire to connect the portable relay to Thorne's command net. His movements were deliberate, fingers numb from the chill but steady as he spliced the leads, the faint click of connections echoing in the hush. Sergeant Wilkes oversaw the local squad's perimeter, barking quiet orders to Private Ellis and Corporal Davies. "Eyes out, rifles up. This isn't a stroll." Davies complied, but his glance toward Hargrove carried the residue of earlier tension, a smirk tugging at his lip as if expecting another opportunity to assert the pecking order. Major Reynolds stood apart with Thorne, the two officers murmuring over a folded map, their breaths visible in the cooling air. The drill kicked off without fanfare. Thorne's voice crackled over the shared frequency. "Asset down, grid 052318. Move to secure." The SAS troopers advanced in pairs, low and fluid, vanishing into the folds of the terrain like smoke. Hargrove monitored the flow, his earpiece alive with position pings. "Alpha pair advancing, contact minimal," he relayed to base, voice even. "Delta confirms, link stable." The routine held, but the air thickened with the observers' presence, their quiet efficiency casting a subtle shadow over the local unit. Ellis shifted uneasily beside him, wiping mud from his weapon, while Davies paced the wire's edge, his boot nudging it once. Not enough to disrupt, but a pointed reminder of who held the reins in his mind. As the asset, a mannequin rigged with a simulated injury beacon, came into view, nestled in a shallow depression amid the peat, the teams converged. Thorne signaled the halt, his unit forming a tight cordon, rifles trained outward in practiced arcs. Reynolds's squad mirrored them, but the difference was palpable, the locals' movements edgier, less seamless. The rain-slicked ground claiming an extra stumble from Ellis. "Steady," Reynolds cautioned, his tone clipped, eyes flicking to the SAS line. Thorne nodded acknowledgement, then turned to the asset kneeling to assess with clinical detachment. It was then in the frozen tableau of the drill that the fracture broke surface. One of Thorne's troopers, the scarred sergeant from earlier, approached the mannequin but paused, his gaze locking on Hargrove across the 10 meters of bog. The man's posture stiffened, not in alarm, but in a profound stillness, the kind that rippled through the regiment like a held breath. He straightened slowly, eyes tracing back to Hargrove's forearm, where the sleeve had ridden up again during the wirework, the Moorland tattoo exposed once more. its faint outline of fog-shrouded tors, and a spectral figure unmistakable to those who knew. Thorne followed the sergeant's look, his own expression unchanging, but he rose from the asset with deliberate slowness, crossing the space to Hargrove in 3 unhurried strides. The unit watched, the wind the only sound, boots rooted in the mud as if the moor itself commanded silence. Davy's smirk faded, his face paling under the scrutiny, Wilkes's jaw set, a question forming in his eyes. Reynolds stepped forward, brow furrowed, but Thorne raised a hand, subtle, authoritative, halting him mid-stride. "Lance Corporal Hargrove," Thorne said, his voice low but carrying, pitched for the circle of soldiers now encircling them. No preamble, no theatrics, just the name weighted with the gravity of shared secrets. Hargrove met his gaze, posture unchanging, the radio handset still gripped in one hand. Thorne's eyes held his for a measured beat, then flicked to the tattoo visible now to all in the tight knot of men. That mark, it's not standard issue. The regiment knows it well. Operation Moorvale, 09. The phantom who threaded the net when our bird went dark over the highlands. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading through the frozen ranks. No one moved. The SAS troopers stood at ease but alert, their stillness a wall of confirmation. Hargrove's expression remained reserved, a faint tightening at the jaw the only betrayal, but he nodded once. Acknowledgement, not admission. Thorne continued, tone even, as if reciting a briefing from years past. "Trapped team, rotors shot out, screaming into the void. We're gonna die. No extraction, no backup." Then the relays lit up, improvised signals cutting through the storm, guiding us more to more. Phantom pulled us from the brink, saved the lot. Classified to the bone, but we don't forget. Davy's face drained of colour, his earlier grip on Hargrove's wrist now a ghost in the revelation. He shifted, eyes darting to the ground, the mockery curdling into shame. Ellis stared wide-eyed, the private's earlier stumbles forgotten in the weight of it. Wilkes exhaled slowly, respect dawning in the set of his shoulders, while Reynolds' appraisal turned from neutral to profound, the Major's posture straightening as if saluting with his stance alone. The SAS sergeant stepped forward then, extending a hand to Hargrove. Not a clasp, but a brief touch to the shoulder, the gesture laden with the unspoken code of the regiment. Thorne held Hargrove's gaze a moment longer, then stepped back, his nod encompassing the man and the mark alike. "Not who they thought, eh?" he murmured, the words for Hargrove alone, but the implication hung for all. The circle held, the moorland wind stirring the heather at their feet, but the air had shifted. Shame threading through the locals like the rain through cracks in stone, respect rising in its wake, quiet and inexorable. No cheers, no drama, just the profound hush of recognition, the hierarchy bending under the truth of hidden valor. Hargrove repacked the wire without flourish, his competence now illuminated, the phantom's shadow no longer solitary. The drill resumed, but the moor carried the echo of that reckoning, the unit moving as one, transformed in silence. Thorne fell in beside Reynolds, the officers' conference resuming in subdued tones, while the troopers integrated deeper. Their deference to Hargrove shown in yielded space, shared glances heavy with legacy. Davies avoided his eyes, the corporal's banter silenced. Ellis offered a nod of quiet awe as they shouldered Bergens anew. The extraction point beckoned through the mist, but the day's true pivot had passed, a public unveiling in the heart of the fells, where orders met the unyielding call of what was right. Hargrove led the signals now, his steps measured, the weight of the past lightened by the gaze of men who understood. The regiment's quiet honour bound them tighter, the Moor's indifference yielding to the subtle fire of moral courage. As the column crested the next rise, the rain slackened, the sky cracking with faint light, mirroring the dawn of respect earned in shadows long concealed. The column descended from the rise in a tight, purposeful line, the moorland's undulating turf giving way beneath their boots with a soft, yielding crunch. The mist had thinned to a veil, allowing slivers of pale sunlight to pierce the overcast, casting long shadows across the heather that danced like fleeting memories. Hargrove walked at the center of the signals relay, the radio pack now a lighter burden on his frame, its straps adjusted with the same unhurried precision that had marked his every action that day. Captain Thorne's revelation lingered in the air, unspoken yet palpable, a shift in the subtle dynamics of the group that manifested not in words but in the spaces between them. The way Davies kept a respectful distance, his earlier bravado evaporated like morning dew, the manner in which Ellis fell in step a pace closer, his posture straighter, as if aligning himself with an unseen standard. Sergeant Wilkes led the merged unit now, his pace steady, eyes fixed on the horizon where the extraction flags fluttered faintly against the greying sky. The SAS troopers integrated without fanfare, their presence a quiet reinforcement, but glances toward Hargrove carried the weight of fraternity, reserved nods, a shared economy of movement that spoke volumes in the regiment's silent lexicon. Major Reynolds walked beside Thorne, the two officers maintaining a low murmur of tactical adjustments, their voices blending with the wind's low sigh. No one pressed Hargrove for details. In sterling lines, such histories were guarded like the classified dossiers in the ops room vaults, revealed only when the Moor or the mission demanded it. As they approached the clearing, the Chinook's rotors thrummed back to life in the distance, a rhythmic pulse that underscored the exercise's conclusion. The unit halted at the perimeter, forming up instinctively for the debrief. Bergens dropped with controlled thuds onto the damp ground. Reynolds called them to attention, his voice carrying the clipped authority honed on parade squares from Aldershot to the beacons. "Stand easy but eyes front. Captain Thorne will close out the drill." The men complied, postures rigid yet at rest, the scent of wet peat and exertion hanging heavy in the air. Thorne stepped forward, his figure framed against the looming bulk of the helicopter, its blades carving slow arcs through the mist. He surveyed the line with measured deliberation, his gaze settling once more on Hargrove, who stood at ease amid the support detail, hands clasped behind his back, expression impassive. The captain's face betrayed nothing, no flourish, no raised voice, but in the stillness of his stance, respect coalesced like the gathering light. "Lance Corporal Hargrove," Thorne said again, the words deliberate, drawing every eye in the semicircle. A hush deepened, the moor itself seeming to pause, the distant call of a curlew the only intrusion. Hargrove met the gaze evenly, his shoulders square under the sodden uniform, the tattoo now concealed, but its echo vivid in the collective memory. Thorne held the moment, then executed a salute, crisp, formal, the kind reserved for ceremonies in the regiment's hallowed halls, not the mud of a training fell. His hand rose to the brow of his cap, fingers aligned, the gesture held for a full count of 3 before dropping. It was no casual acknowledgement. It was reform in motion, a public affirmation that bridged the chasm of years and classification. The line froze, Wilkes's breath caught audibly. Reynolds' jaw tightened in realization, while the SAS troopers mirrored the salute in unison, their movements synchronized, a wall of quiet solidarity. "Phantom," Thorne added, his tone pitched low but resonant, the old call sign slipping out like a key turning in a long-locked door. It was the moniker from Moorvale, whispered in debriefs after the Highlands op. When Hargrove, then unattached to any visible unit, had improvised a chain of signals from hidden outposts, pulling the trapped team from the jaws of isolation. "We're gonna die," the frantic transmissions had pleaded, rotors failing over storm-lashed peaks. But Phantom's relays had lit the way, Moorland knowledge turning despair to extraction. No medals followed, no public record, just the regiment's internal ledger, where such debts were etched in indelible ink. Shame rippled through the local ranks like a chill wind across the bog. Davies stood rooted, his face ashen, the memory of his grip on Hargrove's wrist now a leaden weight, the mockery from the ridge and the mess hall curdling into profound regret. He shifted his weight, eyes downcast, the rigid hierarchy that had propped him fracturing under the truth. Ellis too felt it, the young private's earlier stumbles paling against the legend unfolding, his posture straightening further, as if to atone through discipline alone. Even Wilkes, ever the steadfast sergeant, exhaled slowly, his earlier jests about the radio now a distant echo, replaced by a nod of deference toward Hargrove that spoke of re-evaluation deep as the peat. Respect rose in its stead, subtle and inexorable, threading through the unit like the first warm rays breaking the cloud. Reynolds stepped forward after Thorne's salute, coming to attention beside the captain, his own stance a mirror of acknowledgement. No words needed, just the alignment of officers who understood the cost of silence in service. The SAS troopers lowered their salutes in unison, but their eyes lingered on Hargrove with the reserved admiration of peers, one murmuring a faint "well done" under his breath, the praise as understated as the Welsh rain. Hargrove returned the initial salute with precision, his hand steady, then dropped it without flourish, resuming his at-ease position. No emotion cracked his reserve. It was all in the subtle lift of his chin, the quiet dignity that had always underpinned his competence. The debrief followed. Voices measured as positions and timings were logged, but the undercurrent had transformed the gathering. Thorne conferred with Reynolds on adjustments for future drills, incorporating Phantom's protocols into the lexicon without elaboration, ensuring the lesson embedded itself in the routine. Davies volunteered for the kit check, his tone subdued, offering Hargrove a tool without being asked, a small reform, born of the shame that now schooled him. Ellis assisted in coiling the wires, his movements careful, seeking no thanks but earning Hargrove's brief nod in return. Wilkes clapped a hand to Hargrove's shoulder as they packed, the gesture firm, wordless. The sergeant's way of bridging the gap his banter had widened. As the unit boarded the Chinook, the rotors building to a steady whine, the Moor receded beneath them, its vast indifference yielding to the bonds reforged in revelation. Hargrove secured his Bergen in the web seating, the vibration humming through his frame, but for the first time in years the weight felt shared. Back at Stirling Lines the evening would unfold differently. No barbs in the mess hall, whispers shifting from doubt to quiet legend, the hierarchy bending to honor the man who had saved them all without seeking credit. Thorne sat across from him, exchanging a final glance. Stillness conveying what words could not. Gratitude, enduring as the fells themselves. The helicopter lifted off, banking toward Hereford's low skyline, the rain-scoured earth falling away. In that ascent, reform took hold, not in grand decrees, but in the subtle realignments of respect, the silent acknowledgement that true service transcended ranks and routines. Hargrove gazed out the porthole, the Moor's secret safe once more. But his place within the regiment affirmed a quiet transformation etched in the fabric of the day. If this story already has your respect, hit the like button. It helps the story of Ellis Hargrove reach those who still believe in honor. The Chinook touched down on the helipad at Stirling Lines, under a sky heavy with the promise of more rain, the rotors downwash scattering droplets across the concrete like scattered applause. Hargrove disembarked last from the support detail, his boots striking the damp tarmac with a familiar thud. The weight of the radio pack finally eased from his shoulders. The air carried the sharp tang of aviation fuel mingled with the earthy residue of the moors, a scent that grounded him back in the routine of base life. Captain Thorne and his SAS troopers peeled off toward the visitors' quarters without ceremony, a final nod exchanged with Reynolds before they vanished into the low-slung brick buildings. No fanfare marked their departure. In the regiment, transitions were as seamless as the shift from mist to clearing sky. Back in the barracks, the evening unfolded with the clockwork precision that defined Stirling Lines. Reveille had long since given way to the subdued hum of stand-down, the clatter of kit being stowed in lockers, the faint echo of boots on the polished corridor floors. Hargrove made his way to the signals hut, the fluorescent lights casting a steady glow over the rows of consoles and coiled cables. He logged the day's transmissions in the duty book, pen scratching methodically across the page, each entry a quiet testament to the relays that had held true. No one interrupted. The hut, usually a place of hurried queries, stood empty save for him, the door left ajar as if deference had already taken root. In the mess hall that night, the change was subtle, woven into the fabric of the ordinary. The long trestle tables were laden with the standard fare, steak and kidney pie, its pastry flaking under the steam, accompanied by mugs of builder's tea strong enough to stand a spoon in. Hargrove queued as always, tray balanced in his hands, but the line parted slightly before him, Private Ellis stepping aside with a murmured, "After you, Lance Corporal." No elaboration, just the act, eyes averted in quiet respect. At the table, Sergeant Wilkes occupied his usual spot, flanked by the squad. their voices low over the scrape of cutlery. When Hargrove sat, the conversation shifted, not to jibes or jests, but to the Moor's demands, the wind's bite on the ridge. "Solid work on the freaks today," Wilkes said, his tone even, passing the salt without being asked. It was acknowledgement, plain and unadorned, the kind that bound men in the regiment's understated code. Davies entered late. His face still carrying the pallor of the plateau's revelation, Trey clutched tighter than necessary. He took a seat at the far end, away from the core group, and when his gaze met Hargrove's across the table, it held no edge, only a brief nod, shoulders hunched in the posture of one recalibrating his place. The corporal contributed little to the talk, his earlier barbs silenced like echoes swallowed by the fells. No one pressed him. The shame had done its work, reforming the hierarchy not through reprimand, but through the weight of truth. Whispers circulated in the Nafi later, during the evening stand-easy, fragments caught over the hum of the kettle. Didn't know about Moorvale. Phantom, they called him. Not mockery, but awe tempered by restraint, the legend taking shape in hushed tones, passed like a classified briefing from one shift to the next. The days that followed etched the transformation deeper into the base's rhythms. Mornings began with the same reveille blast, the bugle piercing the pre-dawn chill, but Hargrove's presence on the parade square drew subtle shifts. During roll call, the sergeant major's bark included him without the usual perfunctory clip, a fractional pause before Hargrove that acknowledged more than mere attendance. Kit inspections unfolded with precision, Reynolds overseeing from the sidelines, his appraisal now lingering on the signals operator's layout. The Bergen unpacked with flawless order, cables coiled in loops that spoke of hands seasoned by shadows. No praise was voiced. It was in the absence of scrutiny, the way the major's nod encompassed the man entire, past and present aligned. Out on the training grounds, the Moor's echo lingered in the drills. The support wing ran tabs along the perimeter paths, boots pounding the wet gravel in unison, the cold Hereford air biting at exposed skin. Ellis, once prone to stumbles, matched the pace without falter, his form mirroring Hargrove's steady stride. When they paused at the water point, the young private offered his canteen first, a gesture small but laden, eyes meeting in silent solidarity. Davies integrated quietly, volunteering for the comms auxiliary during a navigation exercise, his hands steady on the auxiliary dials under Hargrove's watchful eye. "Like this?" he'd ask, tone stripped of condescension, seeking guidance rather than asserting rank. The grabs and nudges of old were relics now, replaced by space yielded willingly, the rigid lines of hierarchy bending to accommodate the quiet legend at its heart. In the evenings, the barracks hummed with a subdued energy. The memorial wall, with its etched name standing sentinel under the sodium lamps, drew Hargrove less frequently now. The burdens it evoked lightened by shared understanding. Whispers evolved into respectful murmurs in the common room, where off-duty soldiers gathered around the battered armchairs, the air thick with the scent of pipe smoke and polished leather. Tales of the Phantom surfaced not as myth, but as fact, relayed in clipped sentences, the trapped team's desperate pleas over failing rotors, the improvised signals that pierced the storm. No one sought Hargrove's confirmation. Respect manifested in the circle widening to include him. Wilkes pouring an extra measure of tea without comment. Major Reynolds called a unit brief in the ops room one grey afternoon, maps unfurled across the scarred table, the room's walls lined with faded regimental crests. "Incorporate Phantom protocols into the next rotation," he stated, the call sign slipping out naturally, eyes sweeping the room to land on Hargrove. The lance corporal nodded, posture unchanging, but the inclusion was reform incarnate, his hidden expertise woven into the curriculum, ensuring the Moor's lessons endured. Thorne's unit had departed, but a communique arrived via secure channel, a terse, well-held, regiment remembers. No signature needed. It was the bond of silent honour, enduring as the Welsh hills. From that day forward, Hargrove became the quiet legend of Sterling lines, his competence no longer peripheral but foundational, a thread in the regiment's tapestry. No one mocked the man who had pulled shadows from the brink. Whispers changed to tributes, carried on the wind like the curlew's call across the fells. The base's routines persisted, the rain-slicked parade square, the clipped orders at dawn, the unyielding discipline that forged them all. But beneath it pulsed a deeper restraint, a moral courage affirmed in the spaces between words. In the end, it was this British discipline, reserved, internal, expressed through posture and silence, that defined the legacy. Silent honour, like the Moors themselves, revealed its strength not in storms, but in the steady light after, binding the ranks in a quiet, unbreakable whole. Weeks turned into months at Stirling Lines, the relentless cycle of training and readiness etching deeper grooves into the lives of those who called Hereford home. The cold snap of autumn gave way to winter's bite, frost glazing the parade square in crystalline sheets that crunched under boot heels at morning muster. Hargrove moved through it all with the same measured gait, his uniform pressed to perfection, the signals pack slung over one shoulder during exercises as if the weight had never varied. Yet the undercurrents had shifted irrevocably, like the subtle realignment of a compass after a storm, imperceptible to outsiders, but profound to those within the regiment's close-knit fold. In the signals hut, where the hum of standby generators provided a constant underscore, Hargrove's duties expanded without fanfare. Younger operators, including a transferred lance corporal from Aldershot, sought his input during calibration runs, their questions posed in low tones over the glow of monitors. "How do you thread that net in the mist?" one asked once, referring obliquely to the Moor's drill, his eyes flicking to Hargrove's forearm, where the sleeve concealed the tattoo. Hargrove demonstrated with a steady hand, adjusting the dials until the signal peaked clean, his response brief. "Terrain dictates. Listen to the static." No elaboration on Moorvale or the Phantom's improvisations. The lesson embedded itself through action, the hut's air thick with the scent of warm electronics and oiled leather. The mess hall, once the arena for casual dismissals, evolved into a space of quiet equilibrium. Evenings brought the familiar ritual, trays sliding along the counter, the ladle clanging against enamel as portions of Lancashire hot pot were portioned out, steam rising to mingle with the aroma of fresh-baked bread from the Nafi ovens. Hargrove took his place at the central bench, and now the seats beside him filled without hesitation, Ellis sliding in with a nod, his youthful frame leaner from the intensified tabs, carrying the poise of one who had glimpsed true metal. "Passed the signals qual yesterday," the private mentioned one night, voice even, passing the mustard jar without prompt. Hargrove inclined his head, a faint acknowledgement in the set of his jaw, the exchange sealing another thread in the unit's reformed weave. Davies, too, had transformed, his earlier aggressions channeled into disciplined focus. During a joint navigation brief in the ops room, with maps pinned to the corkboard under the harsh strip lights, he deferred to Hargrove on frequency overlaps, his tone stripped of edge. "Your call on the relays, Lance Corporal." The corporal's posture had straightened, the shame of the ridge now a forge that tempered his service, evident in the way he volunteered for night watches, patrolling the perimeter paths where the frost-etched patterns on the chain-link fence. No apologies were voiced. In the regiment, reform came through deeds, the rigid hierarchy yielding just enough to honour the man who had once been its overlooked cog. Sergeant Wilkes embodied the change most subtly, his leadership now laced with an underlayer of consultation. On the drill square under the slate-grey skies that pressed down like a sergeant's glare, he incorporated phantom variants into the endurance phases, simulated blackouts, where teams relied on improvised comms, the wind howling across the gravel as if echoing the Highlands storm. "Follow Hargrove's lead," Wilkes instructed during one such run, his voice carrying over the laboured breaths, the squad's boots striking in unison. Hargrove demonstrated from the rear, relaying mock positions through a handheld shrouded in fog machine haze, his instructions clipped and precise. The men absorbed it, postures aligning in the cold air, respect manifesting in the absence of stragglers, the seamless flow that marked a unit reforged. Major Reynolds oversaw these evolutions from the officers' annex, his greatcoat draped over the back of a wooden chair during briefings, the room's walls adorned with faded photographs of past selections, grim-faced troopers on the beacons, their eyes holding the same reserved intensity. He summoned Hargrove occasionally for private discussions, the door closed against the corridor's murmur, steam curling from mugs of tea on the desk. "Your input on the protocols," Reynolds would say, map unrolled between them, his tone measured, inviting elaboration on the Moorland tactics that had saved lives in shadows. Hargrove responded with economy, tracing routes with a steady finger, the conversation a bridge between past isolation and present integration. No promotions followed immediately. The regiment valued patience as much as prowess, but Hargrove's file thickened with commendations, subtle notations that whispered of consideration for deeper roles. Out on the fells during winter exercises, the Moor's legacy breathed life into the drills. Snow dusted the peat in thin veils, the ground crunching under laden burgans as teams plotted through whiteout conditions. Hargrove's knowledge guided them, his voice steady over the net. Vector shift 2 degrees. Hold formation. The trapped team's echo, "We're gonna die," faded into history, replaced by the quiet assurance of relays that never faltered. Thorne's unit returned once for a cross-training op, the Chinook settling on the same LZ, rotors whipping snow into eddies. The captain sought Hargrove out during the stand-down, their exchange brief amid the circle of steaming canteens, a shared glance, a nod heavy with the unspoken debt of Moorvale. The SAS troopers integrated as before, but now they deferred openly to the Phantom, one offering a spare glove during a halt, the gesture simple, profound. Whispers of the legend permeated the base like the fog rolling in from the Wye Valley, told in the Nafi over pints of bitter, voices low under the vaulted ceiling, the air laced with the hoppy scent and the crackle of the dartboard. Saved the lot, they say. From the brink. No embellishment, just the facts, passed with the restraint of men who knew the cost of silence. Hargrove became the quiet exemplar, his presence on the parade square drawing eyes that lingered, postures straightening in unconscious salute. The memorial wall stood as ever, names etched in enduring stone, but Hargrove's reflection there now carried less solitude, the ghosts of operations past, joined by the living regard of his comrades. In the end, this was the true legacy of that rain-lashed day, a transformation not in thunderous change, but in the subtle realignments of British discipline. Moral courage, once hidden in the Moor's shadows, emerged to redefine the ranks, expressed through eye contact held a fraction longer, silences pregnant with honor, postures that spoke of debts repaid in quiet service. The regiment endured, its quiet professionalism a bulwark against the world's chaos, bound by the internal reserve that turned injustice to integrity, mockery to respect. Hargrove walked the gravel paths of Stirling Lines as he always had, but now the rain fell on shoulders unbowed, the Phantom's light a steady beacon in the fog of routine. Silent honor, like the fells themselves, revealed its unyielding strength in the calm after the storm, forging a legacy that whispered through the generations of those who served. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and justice within the ranks. Thank you for watching the case of We're Gonna Die. Trapped SAS team begged for help. Then the Moorland Phantom saved them all. See you in the next one.